In the harsh winter of 1876, when survival meant more than just finding food and shelter, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell learned that sometimes the most unexpected hand extended in kindness can come from those society has taught you to fear. Clutching her 3-week-old daughter against her chest, standing in the bitter cold outside what was once her home, Sarah had no way of knowing that her darkest hour would lead to one of the most extraordinary friendships in frontier history. This is the true story of how prejudice crumbles in the face of genuine humanity, and how a Sioux chief's compassion would not only save 2 lives, but challenge an entire community's understanding of what it means to be civilized. What happens when the people who share your skin color turn their backs on you, while those you've been taught to mistrust become your salvation? Sarah Mitchell was about to find out, and her story would become a testament to the power of human decency that transcends all boundaries. The November wind cut through Sarah Mitchell's thin shawl like a blade as she stood on the wooden steps of what had been her home for 3 years. In her arms, baby Emma squirmed restlessly, sensing her mother's distress even at just 3 weeks old. Behind the closed door, Sarah could hear muffled voices, the voices of people who had once called themselves her friends, her neighbors, her community. Now they spoke of her as if she were diseased, contaminated, something to be cast out before she could infect others with her shame. Mrs. Henderson's sharp voice carried clearly through the wood. It's not just about the child, though heaven knows that's scandal enough. It's about what she represents. A woman who would carry on with a drifter, a gambler, someone we knew nothing about. What does that say about her character? What kind of influence would she have on our children? Sarah's chest tightened. She had loved Thomas Mitchell with every fiber of her being. Yes, he had been a stranger when he arrived in Millbrook, but he had worked hard at the lumber mill, attended church services, and treated her with a respect and tenderness she had never known. When he proposed after 6 months of courtship, it had felt like a dream come true. Their wedding had been small but joyful, and for 8 blissful months, Sarah had believed she had found her place in the world. Then came the fever that swept through the mill workers that autumn. Thomas had been among the first to fall ill, and despite Dr. Patterson's best efforts, he had slipped away on a rain-soaked Thursday morning, leaving behind a pregnant wife and more questions than answers. It was only after his death, when Sarah had gone through his few possessions, that she discovered the gambling debts, the false name he had used in 3 other towns, the wife he had abandoned in Missouri. The man she had loved, the father of her unborn child, had been a lie wrapped in kindness. The scandal had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Sarah Mitchell was not just a widow. She was the fool who had been deceived by a charlatan, the woman who had brought shame upon the respectable community. When Emma was born 3 weeks ago, no one had come to help. No meals had been delivered. No congratulations had been offered. Instead, there had been whispers and pointing fingers and the gradual but unmistakable isolation that came with being marked as undesirable. And now this? A town meeting held in her own parlor, in the house that Thomas had rented but never fully paid for, with the very people who had once smiled at her across church pews deciding her fate as if she were not even human. "The fact remains," came the measured voice of Mr. Jameson, the banker, "that the rent is 3 months overdue. Mrs. Mitchell has no means of support, no family to speak of, and a child born of questionable circumstances. The Christian thing to do would be to help her relocate somewhere more suitable to her situation." "More suitable?" Sarah repeated the words under her breath, feeling their cruel weight. They meant somewhere far from here, somewhere she could disappear with her shame and not remind the good people of Millbrook of how easily deception could creep into their midst. The door opened suddenly, and Sarah found herself facing 5 familiar faces that now looked at her as if she were a stranger. Mrs. Henderson, plump and self-righteous, avoided her eyes. Mr. Jameson adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat uncomfortably. Pastor Williams, who had married her and Thomas just over a year ago, looked genuinely pained but resolved. Mrs. Cooper and Mr. Bradley, neighbors who had once borrowed sugar and shared weather observations, now regarded her with the careful distance reserved for the diseased or dangerous. Pastor Williams stepped forward, his kind face etched with what Sarah hoped was genuine regret. "Sarah, my dear, we've come to a decision that we believe serves everyone's best interests, including yours. The Ladies' Auxiliary has collected a small sum to help you make a fresh start elsewhere. There's a boarding house in Riverside, about 60 miles south, where you might find work and a place to raise your daughter without the burden of local complications." Sarah looked at each face in turn, searching for some sign of the warmth that had once existed between them. She found none. Even Pastor Williams, who had counseled her through her grief just weeks ago, now spoke to her as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a person in need of compassion. "And if I choose to stay?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Mr. Jameson stepped forward with a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. "The house will be reclaimed tomorrow morning. There are no positions available in town for someone in your circumstances. I'm afraid staying simply isn't a practical option." The finality in his voice made Emma fuss in her arms, and Sarah automatically began the gentle rocking motion that had become second nature. The baby's needs were so immediate, so clear. She needed food, warmth, safety, love. Everything else was just noise created by adults who had forgotten what truly mattered. "I see," Sarah's voice came out steadier than she felt, "and the generous sum the ladies' auxiliary has collected." Mrs. Henderson finally met her eyes, and there was something almost defiant in her gaze, as if she had convinced herself that cruelty could be disguised as kindness. $12.37. It should be enough for train fare and a week's lodging while you find employment. $12.37. Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity of it. These people, who collectively owned half the businesses in town, who attended church every Sunday and spoke eloquently about Christian charity, had managed to scrape together barely enough money to ensure she could leave their sight. It wasn't help, it was payment for her absence. "I'll need until morning to gather our belongings," Sarah said quietly. "Of course," Pastor Williams replied, relief evident in his voice that she wasn't going to fight the decision. "We understand this is difficult, Sarah, but sometimes God's plan requires us to make hard choices that serve the greater good." The greater good, as if her presence somehow threatened the moral fabric of their community. As if her grief and struggle were contagious diseases that might spread to other women, making them question their own certainties about love and trust and the nature of the men they married. After they left, Sarah sat in the empty parlor holding Emma and looking around at the life she was about to lose. The rocking chair where she had nursed her daughter through those first difficult weeks. The window that looked out onto Main Street, where she had watched for Thomas to come home from work every evening. The small bookshelf where she kept her few precious volumes, wedding gifts from a time when people believed in her happiness. She had no family to return to. Her parents had died when she was 16, and she had worked as a seamstress in 3 different towns before meeting Thomas. She had no particular skills beyond sewing and basic housekeeping, no education that would qualify her for teaching or other respectable women's work. $12.37 would disappear quickly. And then what? How did a woman alone with a baby survive in a world that offered so few options for her kind? That night, as she packed their few belongings by lamplight, Sarah made lists in her head. Emma's diapers and blankets were the most important items. Her sewing supplies might help her find work eventually. Thomas's few personal effects, a watch, a pen, a small Bible, might be sold if desperation required it. Everything else would have to be left behind. The baby slept fitfully, waking every few hours to nurse. Each time Emma latched onto her breast, Sarah felt the profound responsibility that came with being the only thing standing between this innocent child and the world's indifference. She had to find a way to survive, not just for herself, but for the tiny person who depended on her completely. As dawn approached, Sarah heard the rumble of a wagon outside. Mr. Jameson had arrived early, apparently eager to reclaim his property and remove any trace of the Mitchell scandal from his respectable street. She wrapped Emma carefully in her warmest blanket, picked up the small carpet bag that contained their entire worldly possessions, and stepped outside into the gray morning light. The train station was a 20-minute walk through the center of town, and Sarah had dreaded this final parade past the shops and homes of people who had decided she was no longer welcome among them. But the early hour meant the streets were mostly empty, and she was grateful for this small mercy. She walked quickly, keeping her eyes forward, trying not to think about how many times she had walked this same route with Thomas, their hands linked, their future bright with possibility. At the station, she purchased a ticket to Riverside with money that felt contaminated by the circumstances of its giving. The station master, Mr. Peters, had always been polite to her in the past, but now he barely looked up as he counted out her change. Even he had heard the whispers, had absorbed the collective judgment that marked her as fallen, unworthy of normal human courtesy. The train was delayed by an hour due to problems with the engine, and Sarah sat on the hard wooden bench in the waiting area, watching Emma sleep and trying to imagine what their life might look like in a new town where no one knew their story. Would she be able to find work that would support them both? Would she have to give up nursing Emma in order to work full-time? The questions multiplied faster than she could find answers for them. When the train finally arrived, belching black smoke and screeching to a halt, Sarah felt a moment of pure panic. Once she boarded, there would be no going back. Millbrook, for all its recent cruelty, was the only home Emma had ever known. The house they were leaving was where the baby had first opened her eyes, where she had learned to recognize her mother's voice, where she had experienced the first weeks of life that would forever be part of her foundation. But there was no choice, and Sarah had learned in recent weeks that dwelling on the absence of choice was a luxury she could not afford. She boarded the train, found a seat near the back where she hoped to avoid curious stares, and settled Emma against her chest as the locomotive lurched into motion. Through the window, she watched Millbrook recede into the distance. The church steeple, the mill where Thomas had worked, the neat rows of houses where people lived who had decided that compassion was conditional, that Christian charity came with terms and restrictions that could exclude even the most vulnerable among them. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words would not come. How do you ask for help from a God whose representatives on earth have just cast you out? How do you maintain faith when faith seems to require you to accept that somehow you deserve this punishment for the crime of loving someone who was not who he claimed to be? Instead of prayer, she found herself making promises to the sleeping child in her arms. She would find a way to provide for Emma, no matter what it took. She would create a life where her daughter was valued and protected. She would never let anyone make Emma feel as small and worthless as she felt right now. These were not prayers exactly, but they were sacred vows, spoken in the whisper-quiet voice that mothers use when they are making the kinds of commitments that reshape their souls. The train carried them south through farmland and small towns, past lives that continued in their ordinary patterns, while Sarah's entire existence balanced on the edge of uncertainty. Emma woke once to nurse, and Sarah was grateful for this simple, clear need that she could meet completely. For these few minutes, as her daughter fed contentedly, Sarah felt competent and necessary. It was a feeling she held on to as tightly as she held her child, knowing she would need to remember it during the harder moments that lay ahead. The whistle blew as they approached their first stop, and Sarah realized that within a few hours, she would be in Riverside, a place where no one knew her story, where she might be able to start over if she was resourceful enough and strong enough and lucky enough to find people who judged others by their present actions rather than their past associations. It was a slim hope, but it was the only hope she had, and she wrapped herself around it like a blanket as the train continued its journey toward whatever came next. Riverside proved to be nothing like the fresh start Sarah had desperately hoped for. The boarding house Mrs. Henderson had mentioned was a dilapidated two-story building that reeked of cabbage and unwashed bodies. The proprietress, Mrs. Gull, was a sharp-faced woman who looked at Sarah and baby Emma with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to extracting every possible penny from desperate people. $2 a week for the room, 50 cents extra for the baby, Mrs. Gull announced without preamble. Payment in advance. No cooking in the rooms, no visitors after 8 o'clock, no noise that disturbs other tenants. Laundry facilities are in the basement, available Mondays and Thursdays only. Sarah had hoped to negotiate a better rate, perhaps offer sewing services in exchange for reduced rent, but Mrs. Gull's expression made it clear that such discussions would be unwelcome. She paid for 1 week, watching her precious funds dwindle to almost nothing, and followed the older woman up a narrow staircase that creaked ominously under their feet. The room was smaller than a pantry, with space for only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair that had seen better decades. The single window looked out onto an alley where stray cats fought over scraps, and the smell of garbage mingled with the autumn air. Emma began crying as soon as they entered, as if she too could sense the wrongness of this place. "Bobbies that cry all night don't last long here," Mrs. Gull observed coldly before disappearing back down the hallway. For the next 3 days, Sarah tramped through Riverside looking for work while Emma rode in a makeshift sling against her chest. She visited every shop, every business, every household that might need sewing done or cleaning services. The answers were always the same. No positions available, no work to be done, nothing for a woman with no references and no connections in the community. By Thursday, with her money nearly gone and Emma growing thinner despite Sarah's efforts to maintain her milk supply on inadequate food, desperation had settled over them like a suffocating blanket. Sarah had sold Thomas's watch to buy bread and milk. but even that small relief was temporary. Mrs. Gull had made it clear that payment for the next week would be required by Sunday, and Sarah had no idea where it would come from. That evening, as she sat in her cramped room trying to stretch a small portion of bread into something resembling a meal, Sarah heard commotion in the street below. Voices were raised in what sounded like argument or alarm, and despite her exhaustion, she moved to the window to see what was happening. A small crowd had gathered around a figure lying in the alley. Even from the second story, Sarah could see the person was injured. There was something wrong with the way they lay, too still, too crumpled. Several men stood around talking among themselves, but no one seemed to be offering help. Without thinking, Sarah wrapped Emma in her shawl and hurried downstairs. Years of tending to her own minor injuries and helping neighbors during illnesses had given her some basic knowledge of caring for hurt people, and whatever was happening outside seemed more important than her own problems. The injured person was a Native American man, probably in his 40s, dressed in a mixture of traditional clothing and white man's garments. Blood seeped from a gash on his forehead, and his breathing was shallow but steady. The men standing around him were local shopkeepers Sarah recognized from her job-hunting expeditions. "Someone should fetch the sheriff," one was saying. "What's he doing in town anyway?" asked another. "Probably drunk and fell off his horse." "Could be trouble. Maybe we should just leave him be and let his own people deal with it." Sarah knelt beside the injured man, ignoring the surprised murmurs of the onlookers. Up close, she could see that his injuries were more than just a simple fall. There were rope marks on his wrists and bruises on his face that suggested violence rather than accident. Someone had hurt this man deliberately. "He needs help," she said quietly, checking his pulse and examining the head wound more carefully. "The bleeding isn't too bad, but he might have other injuries." "Ma'am, you shouldn't be touching him," one of the shopkeepers warned. "Could be dangerous. These people, you never know what diseases they carry." Sarah looked up at the circle of faces surrounding them. These men, who owned businesses and presumably attended church and considered themselves upstanding members of the community, were willing to stand around discussing an injured human being as if he were a dangerous animal rather than someone who needed help. It was exactly the same mentality that had driven her from Millbrook, the ability to categorize people as worthy or unworthy of basic human decency based on circumstances beyond their control. "He's a person," she said firmly. "He's hurt and he needs help. If none of you are willing to provide it, then please move aside so I can." There was something in her voice that must have surprised them, because the men stepped back and allowed her to work. Using water from a nearby horse trough and strips torn from her only spare petticoat, Sarah cleaned the head wound and checked for signs of more serious injury. The man's breathing remained steady, and his pulse was strong, but he showed no signs of regaining consciousness. "We need to get him somewhere warm and dry," she said, looking around at the increasingly uncomfortable faces of the spectators. "He could die from exposure if we leave him here." "The church might take him," suggested Mr. Peterson, the baker she had approached about work earlier in the week. "Pastor Reynolds sometimes helps these people." The phrase, "these people," hung in the air with its obvious implications. Sarah felt a familiar surge of anger at the casual dehumanization that seemed to come so easily to supposedly civilized folks. This injured man was someone's son, possibly someone's husband or father. He deserved better than to be treated like an inconvenience. "I'll take care of him," Sarah heard herself saying. The words surprised her as much as they surprised the men around her, but once spoken, they felt right in a way that few things had felt right recently. "Ma'am, that's not advisable," Mr. Peterson said with genuine concern. "You've got a baby to think about, and you don't know anything about this man or why he's been hurt." Sarah looked down at the unconscious figure and then at Emma, who had remained remarkably quiet throughout the commotion, as if she too understood the gravity of the situation. This man was as alone and vulnerable right now as Sarah felt most of the time. The difference was that she had the power to help him, while no one had been willing to help her when she needed it most. "I know he's hurt and needs help," she said simply. "That's enough." With the reluctant assistance of two of the men, Sarah managed to get the injured man up to her tiny room at the boarding house. Mrs. Gull was not pleased with this development, but Sarah's fierce determination seemed to discourage argument. She made a bed for him on the floor using her own blankets and spent the night monitoring his condition while Emma slept fitfully on the narrow bed. The man regained consciousness near dawn, his dark eyes opening slowly and focusing on Sarah's face with obvious confusion. He tried to sit up, then thought better of it as pain clearly shot through his head. "You're safe," Sarah said softly, the same tone she used to comfort Emma during difficult nights. "You were injured, I'm taking care of you." He studied her face for a long moment, taking in the white skin, the baby sleeping nearby, the cramped room that spoke of poverty and displacement. When he finally spoke, his English was clear and precise, with only a slight accent that suggested it was not his first language. "Why?" he asked simply. It was such a fundamental question, and Sarah realized she didn't have a simple answer. Why had she helped him when others had been content to leave him in the alley? Why had she brought a stranger into her room when she barely had resources to care for her own child? Why had she risked what little safety she had managed to achieve? "Because you needed help," she said finally, "and because I know what it feels like to be alone when you need someone to care." He nodded slowly, as if this answer made sense to him in ways that more elaborate explanations might not have. "I am called Standing Bear," he said. "I lead a small band of my people who winter near the river outside this town." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. She had heard the name Standing Bear whispered in fearful tones during her days of job hunting. The local white population spoke of him and his people as a constant threat, dangerous Indians who refused to stay on the reservation where they belonged. The stories varied. Some said they raided farms, others claimed they threatened travelers. All agreed that Standing Bear was someone to be feared and avoided. Looking at the injured man lying on her floor, Sarah found it hard to reconcile these frightening stories with the reality before her. Standing Bear was clearly a man of dignity and intelligence, someone who had been brutally attacked and left for dead in an alley. Whatever threat he might pose to others, right now he was simply a human being who needed care. "What happened to you?" she asked gently. Standing Bear's expression darkened. "3 men came to our camp yesterday. They said we were trespassing on white man's land, that we needed to move on. When I tried to explain that we had permission from the territorial authorities to winter there, they became angry. They bound me and brought me here to make an example," they said, "to show what happens to Indians who don't know their place." Sarah felt sick. The rope marks on his wrists, the deliberate nature of his injuries. This had not been a spontaneous act of violence, but a calculated attempt to terrorize and humiliate. Standing Bear had been beaten and left in town as a warning to his people, a demonstration of how little protection their legal rights actually provided. "I'm sorry," she said, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to say them anyway. "No one should be treated that way. And yet you help me, though helping Indians is not popular among your people in this place." Sarah looked at Emma, still sleeping peacefully despite everything happening around her. In a few years, her daughter would be old enough to absorb the lessons about who deserved help and who deserved suspicion that seemed to be such an important part of white civilization. She would learn to categorize people by the color of their skin, their origins, their circumstances, and to adjust her compassion accordingly. Unless Sarah taught her something different. "My people cast me out when I needed help most," Sarah said quietly. "I won't be like them." Over the next 2 days, as Standing Bear recovered his strength, an unlikely friendship began to develop in that cramped boarding house room. He told her about his people, about 30 individuals including elders, women, and children who had been trying to find a place to spend the winter months peacefully. They had legal permission to be in the territory, but local whites seemed to feel that legality was less important than their own prejudices and fears. Sarah found herself sharing her own story, the husband who had died and left behind a web of deceptions, the community that had decided she was too scandalous to tolerate, the desperate search for a new beginning that had led her to Riverside. Standing Bear listened without judgment, asking questions that showed he understood the particular difficulties faced by a woman alone with a child in white society. "Your husband's deception reflects on him, not on you," he said when she finished explaining how Thomas's lies had destroyed her reputation. "Among my people, a widow with a child would be protected and honored, not cast out. We understand that children are gifts, regardless of the circumstances of their birth." It was the first time since Emma's birth that anyone had suggested Sarah deserved protection rather than punishment. The simple statement brought tears to her eyes, and she had to turn away to compose herself. By Saturday morning, Standing Bear was well enough to travel, though he moved carefully and the bruises on his face remained vivid reminders of his ordeal. He sat on the edge of Sarah's bed, holding Emma while Sarah packed their few belongings. Mrs. Gull had made it clear that they needed to leave. The presence of an Indian in her boarding house was bad for business, and she could not allow it to continue. "Where will you go?" Standing Bear asked, watching Sarah fold Emma's tiny clothes with practiced efficiency. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. She had exhausted her resources and her options in Riverside. The $12.37 from Millbrook was gone, along with the money from Thomas's watch. She had no prospects for work, no place to live, and a baby who depended on her for everything. "Somewhere else, I suppose. There has to be somewhere that needs what little I can offer." Standing Bear was quiet for a moment, studying Emma's sleeping face with the gentle attention of someone accustomed to caring for children. When he spoke, his words were careful and measured, as if he understood their importance. "My people have a camp by the river about 5 miles from here. We have shelter and food. The children would enjoy having a baby to fuss over, and the grandmothers would welcome another woman to share the work of caring for the young ones." He paused, meeting Sarah's surprised gaze. "You helped me when no one else would. We do not forget such kindness." Sarah stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting. He was offering her a place among his people, people who were viewed with suspicion and hostility by every white community she had encountered. It would mean crossing a line that white society considered absolute, abandoning her racial identity for practical survival. "I don't know anything about your ways," she said slowly. "I wouldn't know how to live as you live." "You know how to care for those in need," Standing Bear replied. "You know how to be brave when bravery is required. Everything else can be learned." Emma stirred in his arms, opening her eyes and looking up at his unfamiliar face without fear. After a moment, she smiled, the first real smile Sarah had seen from her daughter in weeks. It seemed like a sign, though of what Sarah could not be sure. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Gull appeared in the doorway, her face set in lines of determined disapproval. "Time's up," she announced. "I've got paying customers who need this room, and I can't have Indians loitering about scaring off respectable folks." Sarah looked around the miserable little room one last time, then at Standing Bear's patient face, then at Emma, who continued to gaze up at the man holding her with obvious contentment. She thought about the white communities that had rejected her, the civilization that measured worth by circumstances rather than character, the future that stretched ahead of her with no clear path toward security or acceptance. "All right," she said quietly, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "All right, we'll come with you." Standing Bear smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since he regained consciousness. "Good," he said simply. "My people will be glad to meet the woman who has such a brave heart." As they left the boarding house together, Sarah carrying their bags and Standing Bear carrying Emma with surprising naturalness, Mrs. Gull watched from the window with obvious disapproval. Other residents and passers-by stared openly at the strange sight, a white woman walking beside an Indian man, both carrying the belongings of people with nowhere else to go. Sarah felt the familiar weight of judgmental eyes, but this time it felt different. She was not being cast out or rejected. She was choosing to walk away from a world that had never truly welcomed her toward one that offered genuine acceptance. It was terrifying and uncertain, but it was also the first decision she had made in months that felt completely her own. The 5-mile walk to the river took most of the day, with frequent stops to rest and feed Emma. Standing Bear proved to be a patient traveling companion, pointing out landmarks and plants along the way, sharing stories that helped pass the time. As they walked, Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she had not experienced since before Thomas's death. There was something profoundly peaceful about being with someone who asked nothing of her except that she be herself. When they finally reached the camp by the river, Sarah's first impression was of how temporary everything looked. The shelters were designed to be moved quickly. The possessions were minimal and portable. The entire settlement had the feeling of people who were prepared to relocate at a moment's notice. It was the architecture of displacement. She realized the physical expression of a people who could never be certain they would be allowed to stay anywhere for long. Standing Bear's arrival caused quite a stir. People emerged from their shelters to see who he had brought with him, and Sarah found herself the center of curious but not unfriendly attention. The children were particularly fascinated by Emma, gathering around to get a closer look at the white baby who had come to visit their camp. An elderly woman with silver-streaked braids and intelligent eyes approached them with obvious authority. Standing Bear spoke to her in their own language, gesturing towards Sarah and Emma, clearly explaining the circumstances that had brought them together. The woman listened carefully, asking questions and nodding at his responses. When the conversation concluded, she turned to Sarah with a smile that transformed her serious face completely. "I am Gentle Moon," she said in careful English. "Standing Bear tells me you are a woman of good heart who needs a place to heal. You are welcome here for as long as you need to stay." Standing by the river with Emma in her arms, surrounded by people who had been strangers an hour ago, but who were offering her something no white community had been willing to provide, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in months, she could imagine a future that did not involve constant struggle for basic acceptance. These people understood displacement and rejection and the need for refuge. They knew what it meant to be cast out by others and to find strength in caring for each other. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing that no words could adequately express what this offer meant to her and her daughter. As the sun set over the river and cooking fires began to flicker throughout the camp, Sarah helped prepare the evening meal alongside women who spoke limited English, but communicated clearly through gestures and smiles. Emma was passed from person to person, cooed over and cuddled by grandmothers who seemed to consider all children their responsibility. For the first time since Thomas's death, Sarah felt the profound relief that comes from not having to face the world completely alone. Winter settled over the river camp like a familiar blanket, bringing routines and rhythms that Sarah had never experienced but somehow recognized. She learned to rise before dawn to tend the fires, to prepare food that would sustain people through long, cold days, to care for children as a collective responsibility rather than an individual burden. Emma thrived in this environment, passed from lap to lap throughout the day, speaking her first words in a mixture of English and Lakota that delighted the elders. Gentle Moon became Sarah's patient teacher, showing her how to tan hides, preserve meat, and create clothing that would survive harsh weather. The work was physically demanding but oddly satisfying in ways that sewing for white ladies had never been. Here, every task served the survival and comfort of people she had come to care about deeply. When she stitched a winter coat for one of the children, she could see immediately how it would protect them from the wind. When she helped repair a shelter, she knew exactly who would sleep more warmly because of her work. Standing Bear proved to be a thoughtful leader who valued consensus over authority. Sarah watched him navigate disputes and make decisions, always consulting with the elders, always considering how his choices would affect the most vulnerable members of their community. It was a style of leadership completely different from what she had observed among white men, more collaborative and less concerned with individual recognition. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to understand that she was witnessing something remarkable, a functioning society that prioritized care for its members over accumulation of wealth or status. Children were treasured regardless of their parentage, elders were honored for their wisdom rather than dismissed as burdens, and women held real power in decisions that affected the community. It was everything she had hoped to find in white civilization, but had never encountered there. The first real test of her place in the community came in late December, when 3 white men appeared at the edge of camp, demanding to speak with Standing Bear. Sarah recognized one of them, Mr. Garrett, who owned a large farm outside Riverside, and who had refused to consider hearing her for seasonal work. The other 2 were strangers, but their hostile expressions and the rifles they carried made their intentions clear. Sarah was helping prepare the midday meal when the men arrived, and she instinctively moved closer to where Emma was playing with the other children under Gentle Moon's watchful eye. Something about the visitor's posture and tone suggested trouble, and her protective instincts had become finely tuned during her months of vulnerability. "You Indians need to move on," Mr. Garrett announced without preamble when Standing Bear emerged to greet them. "This land's been claimed by white settlers, and there's no room for your kind here anymore." Standing Bear listened calmly, then responded in his measured way. "We have papers from the territorial authority giving us permission to winter here. The land is not yet claimed by any individual. We harm no one and take only what we need to survive." "Papers don't mean nothing when decent folks are afraid to let their children play outside," one of the strangers growled. "Word is you're harboring criminals and fugitives. That's not something we can tolerate." Sarah felt her blood chill. They were talking about her. Somehow, word of her presence in the Indian camp had reached the white communities, and her association with Standing Bear's people was being used to justify whatever action they were planning to take. "We harbor only those who need shelter and protection," Standing Bear replied evenly. "This is an ancient right that civilized people should understand." "Ancient rights?" Mr. Garrett spat. "You people talk about ancient rights while you're stealing white women and corrupting white children. That baby should be raised Christian and civilized, not running wild with heathens." The accusation hung in the air like a physical blow. Sarah realized that Emma had become a symbol in whatever narrative the local whites had constructed about the Indian camp, the innocent white child who needed to be rescued from contamination by savage influences. It was the same logic that had driven her from Millbrook, the same need to categorize and judge and exclude based on predetermined ideas about who belonged where. She stepped forward before Standing Bear could respond, moving into the circle of confrontation with Emma riding on her hip. The three white men looked at her with expressions that mixed surprise, disapproval, and something that might have been pity. "This is my daughter," she said clearly. "I'm here by my own choice, and she's exactly where she belongs with her mother, among people who value her for who she is rather than what she represents." Mr. Garrett's face reddened. "Ma'am, these people have obviously filled your head with nonsense. A white woman's got no business living like a savage, especially when she's got a child to consider. We're prepared to help you return to proper society where you can raise that baby right." "Proper society," Sarah repeated, tasting the bitterness of the phrase. "You mean the society that cast me out when I needed help most, the people who decided that my circumstances made me unworthy of basic human decency, the civilization that would rather see a baby hungry than accept help from the wrong kind of people." The men exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for this response. They had expected to find a captive white woman grateful for rescue, not someone who would defend her choices and challenge their assumptions about what constituted proper behavior. "Ma'am," the second stranger said in a tone he probably meant to sound reasonable, "you've obviously been through some hard times that have confused your thinking. But that doesn't mean you should expose an innocent child to heathen influences. That baby deserves to grow up Christian and educated, not running around half-naked with Indian youngsters." Sarah looked at Emma, who was indeed dressed in the practical, comfortable clothing that Gentle Moon had made for her, soft leather and warm furs that allowed her to move freely and stay warm during the long winter days. Her skin was healthy, her eyes were bright, and she laughed more than she had during their desperate months in white communities. If this was what corruption looked like, Sarah thought grimly, then corruption was far preferable to the civilization being offered. "My daughter is healthy, happy, and loved," Sarah said firmly. "She's learning 2 languages, she's surrounded by people who consider her precious, and she's growing up understanding that human worth is not determined by skin color or social position. If you think that's harmful to her development, then we have very different ideas about what children need." Standing Bear stepped closer to Sarah, not in a threatening way, but in a manner that clearly indicated his support for her words. Other members of the community had begun to gather at the edges of the confrontation, and Sarah could feel their quiet solidarity, even though most of them could not follow the English conversation. "The woman speaks for herself," Standing Bear said calmly. "She is not our prisoner but our friend. The child is not our victim but our joy. If you have complaints about our presence on this land, you may address them to the territorial authorities who gave us permission to be here. If you have threats to make, you should know that we are peaceful people who defend ourselves only when necessary." The implicit warning in his words was clear enough that the 3 men shifted uncomfortably, suddenly more aware of how outnumbered they were. What had probably seemed like a simple matter of intimidating a small group of displaced Indians was becoming more complicated than they had anticipated. Mr. Garrett made one last attempt. "Ma'am, if you won't think of yourself, at least think of that baby. What kind of future can you give her living like this? No education, no proper marriage prospects, no place in decent society. You're condemning her to a life of hardship and isolation." Sarah considered his words carefully. What kind of future was she giving Emma? A childhood among people who valued kindness over status, who shared resources rather than hoarding them, who resolved conflicts through discussion rather than violence. A place where her daughter would learn that human worth was not measured by material possessions or social position, but by character and contribution to the community's well-being. "I'm giving her a life among people who understand that civilization is measured by how we treat those who are different from us," Sarah said quietly. I'm showing her that family is defined by love and loyalty rather than blood or law. I'm teaching her that home is wherever you find people willing to share their fire and their food and their protection with those who need it most. The confrontation ended without violence, but Sarah knew it would not be the last. Word would spread about the white woman who had chosen to live with Indians, who defended their ways and raised her child among them. Some would see this as confirmation of their beliefs about the corrupting influence of savage peoples. Others might begin to question what they had been taught about who deserved compassion and who deserved condemnation. That evening, as the community gathered around the central fire to share the day's events and plan for tomorrow's necessities, Gentle Moon drew Sarah aside for a private conversation. "The white men will come again," she said simply. "Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. They cannot allow what you represent to continue without challenge." Sarah nodded. She had understood this from the moment Mr. Garrett recognized her. Her presence in the Indian camp was not just a personal choice, but a political statement that challenged fundamental assumptions about racial boundaries and social hierarchy. By choosing to live among Standing Bear's people, by raising Emma to see them as family, she was demonstrating that the barriers between white and Indian society were artificial constructions rather than natural law. "What you represent is dangerous to their way of thinking," Gentle Moon continued. "If a white woman can choose to live as we live, if a white child can thrive in our care, then perhaps we are not the savages they need us to be. Perhaps the problem is not with our ways, but with their own." That night, lying in the warm shelter that had become more home to her than anywhere she had lived since childhood, Sarah held Emma close and listened to the quiet sounds of the community settling into sleep. Children's voices gradually faded, adults finished their evening tasks, elders concluded their discussions of the day's events. It was the sound of people who cared for each other, who found security not in walls or weapons, but in the certainty that they belonged to something larger than themselves. Over the following weeks, the pressure from outside communities increased steadily. Territorial authorities who had previously been content to ignore the small band suddenly found reasons to question their legal right to remain by the river. Local newspapers ran stories about the threat posed by Indians who refused to relocate to designated reservations, stories that always mentioned the white woman and her child who had been seduced by savage ways and needed to be rescued from their own poor judgment. Sarah read these accounts whenever Standing Bear brought newspapers back from his trips to town for supplies, and she was amazed by how completely her actual circumstances had been transformed into a narrative that served other people's political and social needs. According to these stories, she was a victim of Indian cunning, a helpless woman whose natural feminine weakness had made her susceptible to manipulation by people who meant to use her and her child for their own purposes. The real story, that she had found acceptance and support among people who measured worth by character rather than circumstances, was too dangerous to tell. It suggested that white civilization might not represent the pinnacle of human social development, that there might be other ways of organizing communities that better served the needs of all their members. By spring, the pressure had become unbearable. Standing Bear called a council meeting to discuss their options, and the conversation was conducted in both languages so that Sarah could participate fully in the decision-making process. The consensus was clear. They would need to move deeper into the territory, away from white settlements, if they wanted to maintain their independence and continue living according to their own values. "You do not have to come with us," Standing Bear told Sarah privately after the meeting concluded. "This is our battle, our struggle. You have your own people to return to if you choose." Sarah looked around the camp that had become home, at the people who had accepted her when acceptance seemed impossible, at Emma playing contentedly with children who considered her their sister. The white communities that Standing Bear called her people had never truly been hers. They had only welcomed her when she conformed to their expectations, and they had cast her out the moment her circumstances became inconvenient. "These are my people," she said simply. "This is my battle too." The journey deeper into the territory took 3 weeks, traveling slowly to accommodate the elderly and the children, stopping frequently to rest and assess their surroundings for potential threats. Sarah had never traveled so far from the settlements of her birth, had never experienced the vast silence of genuine wilderness or the particular beauty of landscapes unmarked by white habitation. Emma celebrated her first birthday during the journey, surrounded by people who sang traditional blessing songs and offered gifts made from materials gathered along the trail. It was nothing like the birthday celebrations Sarah had imagined during her pregnancy, but it was perfect in its own way, a recognition of how far they had all traveled, both literally and figuratively, from the people they had been a year ago. They established their new camp in a valley protected by hills and accessible only through passes that could be easily watched. It was beautiful country, rich with game and water, suitable for the kind of sustainable living that Standing Bear's people had practiced for generations. Sarah helped build their new shelter, working alongside women who had become closer to her than any friends she had known in white society. As summer settled over their new home, Sarah realized that she no longer thought about returning to white civilization. The woman who had been cast out of Millbrook felt like someone from another lifetime, someone whose desperation and vulnerability had made her unable to see possibilities that seemed obvious now. Emma was walking and talking, equally comfortable in Lakota and English, as much at home among her adoptive extended family as any child born into the community. One evening in late summer, as Sarah sat by the river watching Emma play with the other children while the adults prepared for the evening meal, Standing Bear joined her on the bank. "Do you miss it?" he asked quietly. "The life you left behind?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Did she miss anything about the world of her birth? The isolation of nuclear families, each struggling alone with problems that could be shared. The competition for resources that turned neighbors into rivals. The rigid social hierarchies that determined worth based on circumstances rather than character. "I miss the idea of it," she said finally. "I miss believing that civilization means what I was taught it means, progress and enlightenment and moral advancement. But I don't miss the reality of it. I don't miss being judged instead of known, excluded instead of embraced, diminished instead of valued." Emma ran over to them at that moment, chattering excitedly about something she had discovered in the shallow water. She climbed into Sarah's lap with the absolute confidence of a child who had never doubted her welcome anywhere, who had grown up understanding that she belonged simply by virtue of existing. "She will grow up free," Standing Bear observed, watching Emma return to her play. "Free from the fear that her worth depends on other people's approval, free from the belief that some humans matter more than others, free to measure civilization by how it treats all its members, not just the powerful ones." That night, as the community gathered around the fire for stories and songs, Sarah held Emma and looked around at faces illuminated by firelight faces that belonged to people who had taught her what family actually meant, what home actually required, what civilization actually looked like when it prioritized care over conquest. She thought about the woman she had been when she first met Standing Bear, desperate and alone, and convinced that her worth was determined by other people's willingness to accept her. That woman had been rescued not by charity or pity, but by the radical idea that human value was inherent rather than earned, that belonging was a birthright rather than a privilege to be granted or withdrawn based on conformity to arbitrary standards. Emma fell asleep in her arms as the fire burned lower and the evening stories concluded. Around them, the community settled into the peaceful rhythms of people who had found their place in the world and were content to be exactly where they were. It was not the life Sarah had planned, but it was the life she had chosen, and the choosing had made all the difference. Years later, when Emma was old enough to understand the full story of how they had come to be part of Standing Bear's community, Sarah would tell her about the night in Millbrook when the good Christian people had decided that some children were more worthy of love than others, some mothers more deserving of support, some families more acceptable than others. She would explain how a Sioux chief's simple act of compassion had saved not just their lives, but their souls, teaching them that the most important human quality was not the ability to judge others, but the willingness to see past surface differences to the common humanity that connected all people. For now, walking back to their shelter with Emma sleeping peacefully against her shoulder, Sarah simply felt grateful for the journey that had brought them to this place where they were known and valued and protected not despite their circumstances, but because of their essential worth as human beings. It was a gift she had never expected to receive, a gift she would spend the rest of her life learning to give to others who found themselves cast out by a world that had forgotten what civilization actually meant. In the distance, coyotes called across the valley, their voices carrying messages of survival and adaptation, and the endless possibility of starting over in places where acceptance was not conditional, and belonging was not earned but freely given. Sarah listened to their song and smiled, understanding finally that home was not a place but a recognition, not a building but a welcome, not a destination, but a choice to value what mattered most in the brief and precious time they all had together on this earth.